Actually, just one more. I'm going to just read this. This is the whole of the Beatitudes. We talk about this, and then we'll go on. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. The disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. In the Jewish tradition, when you taught, you would sit down, so maybe I'll just get my stool. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." The first of the Beatitudes is, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, not yet. We've been reading as a guide this during a book called Kingdom Ethics, exploring Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and his invitation to a new way of living. And one of the interesting things about this, I remember talking about this in seminary, and one of our professors pointed out, he says, this is what we call the Sermon on the Mount, because Jesus is on this mountain or this big hill when he teaches this. If you go to the Gospel of Luke, it was called the Sermon on the Plain, because Jesus is on the plain and he teaches much of the same things you see in the Sermon on the Mount. Some are a little different, like here we have the blessings, Beatitudes, and in Luke you have the woes, woe to you. So, blessed are you, woe to you. Matthew doesn't go there. What's interesting, though, in this verse is that in Luke it doesn't say blessed are the poor in spirit, it just says blessed are the poor. And I remember one of the professors at the time commenting, the one gospel he says is really trying to emphasize is, those of us who aren't poor being the spirit of humility. And Luke was much more emphasizing, justice in the poor. And as I was reading this book, the author's comment says, actually, if you read the Hebrew, he says the Hebrew word, the Beatitudes, actually Jesus reflecting on Isaiah 61, which is the same passage we read last week when Jesus begins his ministry in Luke. He gets up and reads from Isaiah 61, where it says, "God's Spirit is upon me because he has sent me to proclaim good news to the poor, cover your sight to the blind, set the oppressed free, proclaim the year of God's favor." And so the word poor, we have this Greek, but Jesus is speaking Aramaic. It's based on the Hebrew, and in Hebrew the word means both. It's both those who are actually poor, those who are oppressed, who've been pushed down, and those who understand that they are in need of God, that they cannot control their own lives, that everything is beyond them. Now, what's interesting about that is, in some ways, it's easier to be poor in spirit when you are poor. All right? Not that you want to be, but who wants to be. But the author was commenting, he says, just as I'm writing this across the street, he said, there's a family with 2 teenage daughters who are being evicted from their house because the father lost his job and took another one, and they can't afford the house payments anymore. And often what we do when we stand outside of that is we say, what's wrong with these people that that this happened to them? Instead of saying, what's wrong with our society that we would actually live in a place that puts people out on the street when they need a home? Which is in many ways what Jesus would ask. And so what Jesus is saying is, blessed are the poor in the spirit. He's saying both of that. What? God is blessing those who are poor, who've been oppressed and pushed down, that God is with them and God is going to deliver them, but also that God is inviting us to see with their eyes. I remember when I was on internship, and I think some of you have shared this story, but my supervisor, Reggie, is an African-American pastor, very dynamic, and we were talking about race issues, and he shared a story about being followed home by the police when he was first in town. He had a new car. It was a Ford Taurus, which isn't, top line, but it was new, and it was a big car. The police followed him home. And I was kind of surprised, because, I'd been my history classes in high school, and the civil rights movement took care of all that stuff, right? You're supposed to say that. And I remember him, saying how he got home, and he said he sat in the front of his house in his car for half an hour until the police left. I'm like, well, why didn't you just get out of your car and go into your house? And he says, well, they would have probable cause. They could have said I was fleeing the scene and beat me up, He said, but if I'm in the car, they'd have to pull me from the car. Right. And what shocked me was not just that happened, but suddenly I had this realization that if I saw someone in a really nice car who was black, I'd be more likely to think that they had stolen it than if they were white. And I did not realize that, we have what's called, we think of racism as what oppresses people who are minorities. What we forget about is what we call white privilege. That the privileges we're given because we're white. That we don't have to worry about those things. We don't have to think about it because white people, it's not going to happen to us if we're white. But if you're not, those are things that happen. And so, Jesus is inviting us to enter into the places of those who are in different places from us. And I remember when I actually shared that with Ricky. I told him that. It shocked me to think that. I just felt this shame over it, that I realized that here I was sitting here, and even when I was in high school, my best friends were from Jamaica and from families from the Philippines and Hawaii. We only had 4 kids who weren't white in my school, and they were my best friends. So I thought, and to realize that I felt that way too. And he said, it's okay. He said, God is opening your eyes. God is opening your eyes. And part of what the Beatitudes is talking about is it's saying that God is with those who are poor and oppressed, with those in these difficult places. But God is also with us whose eyes are being opened. That all this is like, it's a dark gift. God is the one giving this grace of our eyes being open. It's not that we have to become this. We don't have to become poor, because that's something we can do. You ever tried? Become more of something? How does that work? It's not really well. It's often that God puts us in places, in situations that change it. Well, you know what? When we would experience it too, and some of us here have been in places where, we've struggled. Some of us have been homeless, struggled with addictions, and you know what? Suddenly those other people who have those same problems, you understand more. Maybe one thing a lot of us can understand is before I had kids, I couldn't believe those folks who kids were acting up out there. You know what I'm talking about? Then you have these say, oh, I get it, right? You have to be there, and that's part of what's saying is, what? God is with people in difficult places, but God also wants us there. So maybe a better way of putting this, go quick on now, Ryan, is to say, blessed are the humble before God, who cares for the poor and humble. Blessed are the humble before God, who cares for the poor and humble. Now, we go on to the next of the Beatitudes. It says, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And, this is interesting. When you think of the meek, what kind of person do you think about?
Weak.
Shy, kind of scared, right? Give a kid a school, right? Now, there's a little something to it, because actually, the word actually, in some ways, means more like, we've heard of humble, blessed are the humble, or blessed are the meek. But actually, think of humbled, all right? He's saying that those who've been pushed down, who've been beat up, they've been humbled, and saying those are people who will inherit the earth, right? When those who want to take over and take control of things, how do they keep, the land and the wealth for themselves? They use violence. You put down other people, right? So the people who've been humbled, those are the ones who God is going to give the earth to. But the word also means something else. And also it can mean tamed. And it's an interesting thing, because, again, we think of meek, but it's rather what we talked about earlier, of that surrender to God. Now, if we're surrendered to God, if all that matters is what matters to God, what do we care about what other people think? Right? I think of, have you seen the movie Braveheart, which is, sometimes say it's kind of like Gandhi with blood. Right? But this guy who the country is under rule of an outside power, and it's very oppressive, but he just wants to go along so he can live with his family until they kill his wife. And now he has nothing to lose, and he finds in the journey this deep connection that God is at work in this. But what do you do to someone who doesn't care what you do to them? Who's not afraid? And the thing though about that movie is it's also very violent, but implied in this term is a different thing. It's saying that it's a way of saying, I don't care what you do, I'm going the way of God, but it's a way of peace. And I think of the story of this monk. This invading army comes to this town. The people have all fled except this one monk who's sitting there just writing at his desk. And the general of the army comes in. He says, you will tell us where the people are. He says, no, I won't. And the general becomes very angry. He says, don't you know that I can have you run through without batting an eye? The monk says, don't you know that I can be run through without batting an eye? And the general bows to him. There's this deep sense of this courage of, that if God is really in charge of things, it doesn't matter what anybody else is about. I'm going to walk that way, and whatever might come. And so maybe a better word we click on is, blessed are those who are surrendered to God, who is the God of peace. Blessed are those who are surrendered to God, who is the God of peace. The next one, I'm touching these briefly because in many ways they're saying many of the same things in different ways, nuance. But blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. And when you think of righteousness, what do you tend to think of? I don't smoke, drink, or do drugs, right? Yeah. You know what I mean? And we're a very individualistic society. So when someone is focused on ourselves and being righteous, what do we call that? Self-love or self-righteous. Yeah, I'm better than all you. And this is completely the opposite. The word righteousness is not an English word. In Greek or in Hebrew, it's make sure I say this right. Tzedakah, or it's related to mishkan. It means justice, right? Blessed are those who are hungry and thirsting for justice. Right? And it's two-sided again because it's for those who are hungry and thirsty right now, who don't have what they need, who want justice, and for those of us who identify with them and hunger and thirst that justice will happen for them, they're going to be filled. The next one said, another way of saying so is, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice that delivers and restores the covenant community, who restores the community, for God is a God who brings justice.